Hello, Kyle Malone from alacartegp.com here. Welcome. Today is Payables 101 within Microsoft Dynamics GP, and we'll be working with version 2018. Most of what you'll see today applies to 2018, obviously, and also applies to just about all of the older versions as well. The new features that do come with 2018, we'll definitely be sure to point those out as we go. But like I said, most of what you see will apply to just about everyone that's wanting to learn more about GP. So we'll take a quick look at the agenda before we dive in. We're really going to cover everything there is to cover with the Payables module within Microsoft Dynamics GP. Setup, cards, transactions, inquiry, reports, utilities, and then as we go through, we'll throw some tips and tricks in along the way. One thing to note is we will not focus on the purchase order processing module. The purchase order processing module brings in inventory, and there's kind of a lot more moving pieces. It's definitely not GP 101. So that session will come in a later date. Today is purely payables. So without further ado, we'll dive right in. So I mentioned that today we would be working with GP 2018, and here you are. If you're familiar with GP, 2018 looks pretty familiar. But for the most part, GP has been around for quite a while, so what you see is typically what you're used to. So the purchasing module, the payables module, we're going to go down to the payables purchasing module down here on the bottom left. And first things first, we'll go ahead and we'll start with the payable setup. We won't spend a lot of time in setup, but we will go through some of the key components that you want to make sure you have set up from the get-go. Good place to start here is with our aging periods. You have two options at the top. You can either age based on the due date or the document date. Since typically your vendors give you different payment terms, it's typically best practice to age based on the due date. On the flip side, if we're talking receivables, you actually might want to base your aging based on your invoice date. But again, we're kind of at our vendor's mercy here for the most part. So due date is what we're going to leave it with. Our aging periods here, we can really put in anything we want. So it gives you these ones by default. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and add a couple extras in here. So again, they're your aging periods. Set them up however you would like. So next bit here, we have the apply by. When you're setting up the auto apply process in GP, so if we're going to auto apply a payment or a credit memo to an outstanding invoice, you can say auto apply based on the oldest document date or based on the oldest due date. Really here, not going to be a huge deal, but just kind of an FYI there. Moving along, default summary view. We're going to go into a window later where it's the vendor summary view. You can set your amounts to display based on the amount since your last close, assuming you're running your year-end close process or your fiscal year or your calendar year. Probably going to be a preference thing, not a big deal to change it at a later date. But for now, I'm going to set it to fiscal year. Checkbook ID, that's going to be my default checkbook ID as I'm building batches. So we'll leave it at Uptown Trust for now. My check format. By default, GP gives you a couple different check formats, so you might take a look at your check stock. If your check is at the very top, I might go ahead and select the stub on top. If I have a check stub where the check is in the middle and then I have a remittance on the top and bottom, there's going to be another option in here that might more closely resemble that option. But for now, I'm going to leave it to stub on top. Another option that comes up here pretty frequently is this option down here, the print previously applied documents on a remittance. So if I have an invoice and then it's fully applied with a credit memo, and then later I cut a check to the vendor for a totally separate invoice, when that vendor gets that remittance, do they want to see that invoice and that credit memo that was applied separately, or do they not want to see it and they only want to see what that check was cut for? So just something to keep in mind. We will leave it. It is enabled by default, but that's kind of what that refers to. Moving on here, you have a couple different passwords in the system. So if we want to enable write-offs, but we want to password protect it, you can set up a password here. If we want to set a password to take a vendor off hold, you can do that here as well. And then last couple of bits here before we move out of the setup window, there's an option here to warn if vendor has existing purchase order. I would recommend going ahead and enabling that now. So if you do get into the situation where you are using purchase orders in the system, you want to make sure that the payable invoice that you are processing is going to be applied to the existing PO. So enable this option. It'll just prompt you if you ever try to process a regular payable invoice and not tie it to a PO. So again, I would recommend enabling it. No harm, no foul though. And then last bit down here, allow duplicate invoices per vendor. This is going to be situational, but I might recommend selecting no. So we really want to make sure that we're not going to pay the same vendor twice. So no might be my recommendation there. We'll take a quick look at the options here. If we ever want to change our numbering, if we ever want to change our prefixes on our numbers in the system, we can do that here. So by default, GP gives you, I don't know, roughly 100 trillion documents, room for 100 trillion vouchers in the system. We'll go ahead and we'll trim that down a little bit. We don't really need that many leading zeros. Same thing with payments, don't need that much. And then tax schedule IDs, if you're trying to track use tax or really just tax in a separate field when you get it from the vendor, you can set up tax schedules in the system, and we'll kind of take a look at that later as well. And then the last two bits down here, you have user-defined fields. When I am setting up a vendor, there are two user-defined fields on that vendor window. The first one here, we have it labeled as being type. If the second one, if I want to call it something like, I don't know, what's the region of that vendor, I can say that the user-defined field 2 is to be used for the region. So that's what those are used for. And then we'll go ahead and we'll get out of our Payable setup window. And let's take a look at the vendor class options. So vendor classes are really used for two things here. For one, it's used for reporting purposes. If I set up a class called utilities, I can quickly run reports in the system to say, show me all of my outstanding payables for my utility vendors. So classes, good for reporting. Also, classes are good for speeding up the process to create vendors as you go through. So the beauty is, I set up a class and I can populate all of these options that you see here in front of you. And as I'm setting up a new vendor, I can say, well, this is a Australian vendor. So I can actually just select the Australian vendor class, and then it populates all of these fields for me automatically. So that way I don't have to set up those fields again and again and again when I'm setting up vendors. So again, classes, reporting, and speeding up the process to create new vendors. And most of what we're going to look at in the next screen with the vendor setup, we will cover these options then. But just know classes are under setup. And really last thing here for the setup windows in general is email settings. Within Dynamics GP, you do have the ability to set up emailed remittances for payables. Once you're using purchase orders, you can email purchase orders out of the system. But under this email settings window is kind of where you would go into that. This is a 101 class, so I can't really spend the time to go into what it takes to get the email set up. It is a little more, there's a couple more steps there than we have time for today, but just know that you can email from the system. All right, so moving on. So our setup is complete. We have the foundation laid. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at the cards. So cards in the system, those are your master records. I'm in the purchasing module, so my cards are going to be things like vendors, vendor addresses, buyers. If I'm looking in the sales module, my cards are customers. If I'm looking in the financial module, my cards are checkbooks or GL accounts. So you get it, it's the master records in the system. So we'll go right in here. Let's take a look at the vendor. And I'm actually not going to go through the process of setting up a new vendor from scratch. It's kind of tedious, and for the most part, I think everyone gets it. But we will take a look at an existing vendor in here, and we'll kind of talk about some of the things that aren't so obvious. So first thing to note here, the name. This is your legal name for this vendor. Very important. This is the name that's going to print on 1099s if there are 1099, if this is a 1099 vendor. So name, keep that in mind. That goes onto your 1099s. That is the legal name. The other name here, check name, you get it. That's what's going to print on the check. Here was the class that we talked about earlier. So this is a Australian vendor. So when this vendor was getting set up, we selected this class ID, and then it populated a lot of these options that we'll be covering next. All right, so back to the main window here. The addresses. Just know that there are multiple addresses that you can put in for a vendor in the system. I can have a primary address. So this could be the vendor's headquarters. This is where their headquarters is located. But then you'll see down here we have a separate address ID for the remit to. So if their headquarters are in Ohio, but their billing department's in Louisiana, I would set up a separate remit to address ID, and it would be their Louisiana information. If there's another address that you want to send 1099s to, you can do that as well. All right, tax schedules and shipping methods. We kind of mentioned the tax schedules earlier, but if you're trying to let the system track taxes in the system, even though for the most part, this day and age, vendors are giving you tax information, fingers crossed, on the invoices. But if that's not always the case and you want the system to calculate your use tax, you would use tax schedules. So I would have a tax schedule. Within a tax schedule, there are tax IDs. Taxes, again, a little more of a bigger conversation. There's a lot more to kind of discuss than I'm going to cover in this 10 seconds. But just know, for now, it's possible to have the system calculate your taxes for purchases. Shipping method, these can really be anything. It's really, on the purchasing side, just used for informational purposes. What does matter is if it's pickup or delivery. The pickup or delivery option in conjunction with the tax schedule will determine if your taxes are calculated based on your address or if your tax schedules are calculated based on the vendor's address. So if I have an option in here that's set for pickup, and I have it attached to this vendor, and I process a stock receipt from this vendor, the taxes are going to calculate based on the pickup address, which was their address. If it is delivery, it's saying that's delivery to me, so therefore taxes calculate based on my address. So pretty important, but again, it's a bigger conversation. Just keep that in mind, I guess. All right, comment fields here. This is really just completely up to you. So we'll take a look at the options in here. So a lot of this stuff, this would have defaulted in from the class setup that we had. But the things that matter here, the payment terms, obviously, whatever the vendor in your agreement is, you would want to put those in here. The payment priority, this is probably the most underused feature in GP that I've seen, at least in the payable side. If I have certain vendors that are the ones that I want to pay every single day, I might go ahead and put in a payment priority of 1 here. And therefore, then when I get into the process where I'm creating check batches, I can just select my payment priority 1 vendors and just create my check payments just for those vendors. There's multiple ways to use the payment priority field, but just keep that in mind. It's there. It can be used during the check printing process. Tax ID, if this is a 1099 vendor, this is important. The tax ID, this is what's going to print on the 1099. And then clicking through here, we have the type and the region. If you recall in the setup windows, these are my 2 user-defined fields. So I did add that region field. If I want to say this is, say Southwest US, I can add that field. I can add that information in there now. Then we get down to the tax type. This again is for 1099 reporting purposes. I'm going to go ahead and leave this out of miscellaneous, and I will also put in its box type, its vendor's box type. And then moving down here, we have 1 payment per vendor or 1 payment per invoice. This is a new feature with 2018. If for whatever reason, when I run a payment process for this vendor, I want them to actually receive 10 different checks instead of 1 check, I can select the option to print a check based on each individual invoice. If that doesn't make sense, which, who am I to say, go ahead and just leave it at the default, which is 1 check per vendor. Other notes here, if you want to set in a minimum payment, so we don't want to be cutting $5 checks, you can do something like that in here as well. I could set this to $5. Credit limit write-off amounts here, kind of the same concept. You can set it to unlimited, or you can add amounts in the system. All right, so we'll close out of this options window. The accounts was the next bit here. So these accounts, these are going to be the default counts that populate as you're processing transactions for this vendor. So when I'm processing a transaction, my default accounts payable account is going to go to 2100. My default debit here, my expense, is going to go to 465.20, which is my travel and service installation GL account. So just keep that in mind. You do want to put this information in because it will speed up your entry process when you're processing payables vouchers. And then last but not least, we can take a look at the email options. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but until you enable these options in here, you cannot email this vendor documents from the system. So just remember that as I'm setting up vendors, I want to go into the email and I want to hit enable, and I want to make sure there's a message ID, which is the email message ID that comes from the system, and then make sure that if I want them to receive a Word document, PDF, XPS, etc., I can set those options in there as well. So that's it. This is a vendor setup in GP. So what else do we have? We'll skip over the addresses. We already kind of looked at that. We're going to skip over the summary for now. We'll come back to that when we talk about the inquiry. 1099 details. If I want to, you know what, I will skip that as well. We'll look at that in the inquiry. And then last bit here, we'll skip over to buyers. Buyers pertains more to purchase order processing. If I want to set up a customer-vendor relationship in the system, so say I owe a customer money, so therefore I want to transfer their balance to the Payables module and then cut them a check, I can set that information up here. And we've actually posted a whole separate video just on the customer-vendor consolidation and refund check process. So if you're interested in this, that's something I would recommend checking out. All right, so we have our setup complete. We have vendors in the system. Let's go ahead and let's move into transactions. So in the transactions here, you'll notice there's a bunch up here that talks about purchase orders, purchase requisitions. Again, today is more of Payables 101, all of the purchase order processing stuff. It's a little more involved, so we're going to skip over this top section. What we care about today is this second section, and we're going to go right into transaction entry. So this is where I'm actually going to process an invoice for my payables. So I get an invoice from the vendor, let's say invoice for rent. I'm going to tap through my fields here. The batch ID, if I'm processing high volume and I have a whole stack of invoices on my desk, I might want to go ahead and just create a batch. So I would call it Kyle's AP, and let's just call it 081518. Create this batch. Yes, if I want to add a comment to this batch, you know, this is just my daily voucher batch. I can go ahead and add that information in here. My posting date, very, very important. Your posting date is the date that it hits the GL. So if I'm getting close to the end of the month and I'm processing invoices from the prior month that need to hit the prior period, I just want to make sure that my posting date here is correct. And then my checkbook ID, what is my default checkbook for when I start processing payments? I'll go ahead and I'll just leave that as is. Save my batch. My batch is now created. And let's go right into selecting our vendor. So just a quick note here, you can always select these lookup buttons, or personally, just hit Control-L to open up the lookup window. I'm going to pick from my list of vendors. My document number, this is the vendor's invoice number. PO number, if it's available, we'll do PO 999. And the purchases amount. So this is really what is my expense for this invoice going to be. What is potentially my document amount that's sitting here in front of me. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it to 1,000. Let's say that the vendor offered me a discount for early payment or for just being their favorite customer. I'm going to go ahead and stick in $10 here from our trade discount. It's on the invoice. I want to key it into a field here in GP. If there is freight for this invoice, I can add that information here as well. Any other miscellaneous costs, I can put that information in. And then if there were any tax information that I want to capture that's not already included on the invoice, I can put that in the tax field. So skipping through here, how about that? The 1099 amount already populated, and that is because this vendor is set up as a 1099 vendor. So as you're going through the system, if I have a 1099 vendor, I want to make sure that that 1099 amount field is populated, or I haven't set up my vendor correctly. If I'm ever processing a invoice for a 1099 vendor, but the invoice itself is not a 1099 transaction, I can change this to anything that I desire. So I can make it 0, or I can switch it back to what it was, or make it a partial, 1099, etc. If I'm ever processing transactions on the fly, So let's say that I've already done a cash transaction with this vendor. I've already given them their money. I can go here and say, okay, this is a $1,035 invoice. I've already actually paid this vendor. I can enter that information here. It just says, okay, well, which checkbook do you want to take it out of? I can add that information and move on. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say that this is a typical voucher that I need to subsequently run the payment process for. Same thing here. If I had already paid them with a check, I could put that information in here. Or if I had paid this vendor with a credit card, I can put the information in here as well. Credit card, it involves a little bit of setup, and we're not going to discuss it in detail today, but just know that you can pay your invoices from GP with credit cards. And if you're interested in learning more about credit cards, check out our YouTube channel, and we have actually a post out there right now about the credit card payment processing. All right, so moving on, we'll take a look at the distributions. So these distributions, notice I didn't enter anything. That's because it all came from the vendor setup. I can click this little, I'll call it a double chevron button here. It'll show me more detail. So what's my GL account that I'm actually hitting? If I want to add a distribution reference, so let's say that I have multiple expense lines on this invoice, and I want to say that half of it is for utility expense at building A and half of it is for utility B or building B. I can enter that information here. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is. So you'll also notice that my purchase amount here comes from my purchase field. My trade discount comes from my trade discount, freight, and then my payable amount is here. So that is what these types here represent. Select OK. I'm done with this invoice. I could select save. The vendor has an existing purchase order. Aha, so this is a good thing. But today we're not worried about purchase orders, so I'm going to go ahead and select continue. If I wanted to take a look at the purchase order that was outstanding, I could select go to, take a look at it, and see if I needed to process this as a purchase order invoice. So again, continue, and I've saved my transaction. So again, I have a batch here. I can go ahead and keep adding my payables transactions, put them in my batch, and then when I'm ready, post my whole batch. But for now, I'm going to say that I'm done. I processed all the invoices that I want to process. Now the process to post this batch from the Payables transaction entry window, go ahead and click this blue arrow next to the batch ID. So that opens up the batch window. And before you hit post, you have to close out of the transaction entry window. Because if I select post before I close it out of the window, the posting button is going to tell me that, hey, someone's still processing this in this batch. You cannot post. Well, that was me. I know that I'm done processing, so I want to close that transaction entry window first. So I'm going to go ahead and post. I'll take a look at just one of these reports for now. And this first report here, this is a Payables transaction posting journal. If you are going to print a report out of the system, this is most likely going to be the one that you want. Gives you all of your header information, who's your vendor, then also gives you your GL distributions. You can reprint just about any report in the system out of GP at a later date. So you really don't necessarily need to be printing anything, but I know that some people are creatures of habit and they want to print things. They want to, be able to file something away. So again, I think this is your best bet here. So I'll go ahead and close this report. And that's it. So we've processed an invoice for a vendor in the system. So what's next? Well, let's go ahead and pay people. I'm going to go into the build payment batch. And again, let's go ahead and let's create our batch ID. So I'm going to do Kyle. And today we're just going to do a checks batch. Do you want to add this batch? Yes, I do. And this is just my weekly check run. For my options here, we're just going to do checks today, but you do have the ability to process EFTs in the system, and you do have the ability to process credit card payments in the system. So again, I'm going to leave it at check. I'm going to go down here and select my checkbook that the cash is coming out of. And if I want to change my posting date or my check dates for this batch, I would go ahead and change them here. My batch is complete. I'm going to go ahead and select save. and then we'll go down here to building our batch. So with the newer versions of GP, there is this field up here called Payment Option ID. Payment Option IDs are just a way to save your batch criteria. So you notice as soon as I selected that, it put in a couple of restrictions down here. And really what this is it's just saying that for this batch, go ahead and select all my Australian vendors that are in my Australian class. So the Payment Option ID is just a way to save restrictions so that you don't have to go in here and enter them over and over and over. So that's it. So let's go in and let's go ahead and just build a batch from scratch here. I'm going to go ahead and I want to build a payment batch just for a certain class. So again, I'm on a lookup field here. I can select my lookup or just hit Control L. And I'll go ahead and select my Australian vendor class, and then I will take it all the way through my Canadian class, and I'll say select, and then I'll go ahead and I'll insert to take that restriction and make it a part of my batch. If I want to add additional criteria to this, so if I want to say, okay, give me everything that's due within the next week. So my system date right now is 04/12/2027. If I want to say, give me everything that's due between now and 04/19/2027, I can add that information in here as well. I'm going to take that one out. And then the last one I kind of like to discuss here is that payment priority. If you recall, we talked about it a little bit earlier when we were setting up the vendor, but if I have certain vendors that I always just want to make sure they're always getting paid, I put in their payment priority of 1. So I'm going to go ahead and import that as one of my restrictions. And now when this batch builds, it's only going to select those payment priority 1 vendors. So what else do we have down here? Automatically apply existing unapplied payments, credit memos, returns. If I have an existing credit memo in the system, I really just, I just want to cut a payment for the net, right? I don't want to send the whole invoice amount if I have an outstanding credit memo. So I'll leave these options enabled so that way the credit memo will automatically apply, and then my check that I'm going to create would just cut for the difference. And then on the remittance, do I want to list all documents? Yes. And then how do I want to sort those documents? I can sort them by the date or the number. And this is just purely on the remittance. So that's it. So this is my criteria. I'm going to go ahead and up here in the top left, select Build Batch. And it kind of takes a second here. It'll kind of blink when it's done. But you see that I now have a batch total. I now have vouchers that I picked up in my payment batch. So I'm going to go to the next step here, which is Edit Payment Batch. And this is just kind of a breakdown of, what did I actually do in that process? What did my build batch basically go out there and mass grab all at once? So I can see that it selected some Ace Travel, and I can click through here and see that it selected these invoices. If I wanted to say, okay, well actually I don't want to pay this invoice, I do want to pay this vendor. Okay, we won't use that vendor. I do want to pay this vendor. So now you see that my batch total has varied a little bit. And now that I have my final batch total here, I'm ready to go in. Let's go ahead and print the checks. So the next step here, print payments. And here I'm in the print payments window. I'll go ahead, if I want to take a look at what I'm about to print, I can select print edit list. So this might be a good report to print out, walk around as kind of your backup for your check batch if you need to get signatures. Once I'm sure that what I have here is what I want to print checks for, I'm going to go ahead and select print. I would just print them to the screen. And voila, here are my checks. These would print onto my check stock and I would be done. So where did that take me? After I hit print, it took me to this post payments window. A couple things to note here. If I print out my check batch and I realize that my alignment's off, or I actually print it onto a non-check or whatever it might be, and I need to reprint that check batch, I have an option here to reprint my payments. I also have the option to basically void everything I just did. Oh, I completely messed up. Let's void it all, start from scratch. But if I'm completely done, I go ahead and select post payments, hit process, and then I have completed my payment process in GP. Okay, so moving on, we'll take a look at manual payments. If I've ever handled a payment outside of GP and I just need to recognize it in the system, manual payments is where I'm going to go. So I would basically go through here and say, okay, it was at this vendor, I handed that vendor $100 in cash. And then I could click through here, I could say, okay, and actually apply it to certain invoices in the system. So, okay, yeah, it was for this invoice and this invoice. So again, the manual payments process, this is recognizing payments that happened outside of GP. Moving on here, had we run through a EFT process instead of a check process, after we posted the batch, you could go to here to the generate EFT file and actually generate the file that you're going to send to the bank to process the EFTs. So just keep that in mind. Apply payables documents. So let's say we're at month end and one of our steps is to make sure that we're cleaning up our open AP. Well, we're going to go to the apply payables documents window. So let's say we're at month end and one of our processes is to go in and clean up our open AP. So what we do is we would select our vendor. We would say, okay, show me the outstanding payment or outstanding credit memo. I see that it has an unapplied amount for $100. Let's go ahead and let's apply this credit memo to any outstanding invoices. So that way it's fewer, so that way it's less AP on the books. And there we are. That invoice was for $153. Well, I've now applied it and I've only got $53 left on that invoice. So close out of there. If I need to void either a payment or an invoice, I can use either the void historical transaction or the void open transactions. Very important topic is there are different statuses for documents in the system. You have work. Work is anything that's unposted in the payables module. You have open. Open is anything that is posted but not fully applied in the payables module. And then you have history. History document is anything that's been posted and has been fully applied. So if I have an invoice that I have posted and then I've paid it with a check, both the invoice and the check are going to be in a historical status in the payables module. So I would go to the void historical transactions window, and that's where I would void my payment, void my voucher, etc. The edit transaction information window, this is kind of a nifty one that a lot of people, I think, don't know it's out there. But if I have a document, and I'll just say I made a small clerical error, or maybe I left something out, or maybe I'd like to add something to it, I can actually open up the transaction and I can change some of these fields. I cannot change the amount. You know, obviously that would be a huge audit concern, but I can change, oh wait, I forgot to put the PO number for this vendor. The description, it actually wasn't for meals, it was for entertainment. I could change that. And then I can also change the due date. So if this particular invoice, it had a 90-day due date, I can change that in the system here as well. After I make my changes, click save, and I'm done. The series post here. Series post is a good way to view all of your outstanding batches at once. So if I'm an accounting manager and our business process is that the clerks enter the vouchers and my job as an accounting manager is to go in and review those batches before they're posted and kind of finalized in the system, I might start with series post and I might click through my transaction batches here. And I might click through my transactions batches here to see what transactions are out here, review them, say they're good to go, and then ultimately post the batch. If I wanted to go ahead and select my batches, select post, and they have been posted. So that is kind of the concept there behind the series posting. Next thing we have here is just a batches window. This should look pretty familiar. We looked at this earlier. But if I ever just wanted to build a batch, or if I want to go ahead and open up a specific batch, I can do that through here. Click on my transactions, and then see ultimately what I'm working with. And last but not least, the edit 1099 transaction information. The 1099 process as a whole is a much larger conversation, but the edit 1099 transaction information window lets me select a vendor, lets me look at a particular invoice, and then lets me change the 1099 amount or 1099 information. So pretty important there, definitely when it comes up to your calendar year end. But just know that if I want to change the 1099 amount for one individual transaction, this is where I'm going. So that's it for transactions. Let's go ahead and let's shift over to the inquiry. The inquiry in the system, inquiry is really just a good way to look at one single thing and get more detail. So if I want to look at one single vendor and look at all of their historical transactions, I would start with the inquiry. If I have an invoice number in mind and I just want to pull up that one invoice, I'm going to go to the transaction by document, put in my invoice number, and look at that one document. So inquiry is good for singles. We will talk about reports later, which obviously is going to give you much more information at once. So first thing we'll look at here, inquiry. I'm going to go ahead and select my vendor. And you'll see I have a couple different options here. If I want to filter this vendor on, say, the document date, I want to filter it just on this date, I can select refresh, and that will show me just those invoices or those documents in that date. And then if I want to go a step further and I'd say, well, let's filter these based on, let's sort these based on the unapplied amount. Well, actually, they're all applied, so bad example. Let's go with the original amount. I select refresh, and you'll see that now these are also sorted based on the original amount. Other things to note here, we just talked about the work, open, and history status. If I only wanted to look at, say, unposted documents, I could select just the work. I can see there are 2 unposted transactions for this vendor. Open, history. There you are. So the transaction by document window, similar concept, but if I had one particular invoice in mind, this might be where I would start. So moving on here, there is the payable summary window. So this is really what I like to call kind of a snapshot window. If I just want to take a look at this vendor at this point in time, I can just type in the vendor, select calculate, and it'll show me what their aging looks like, how much they have open, etc. So the payable summary inquiry is really a good snapshot window. And you'll see here that there are quite a few different ones as far as snapshots are concerned. The vendor inquiry window, if I ever just want to look at a vendor and not make changes to a vendor, I just want to start with the vendor inquiry window. See the difference between this window and then this window. On the right, if I go to this window or I direct someone else to go to this window, they have the ability to click through here and make changes, save those changes. That might be a bad thing in some situations. So you send them to the inquiry window, and again, they can just see the information. They can't make any changes. So more snapshot windows. You got a vendor credit window, vendor yearly, going to give you your yearly information, vendor period, just particular period information. And then also if you just want to take a look at the 1099 details for a certain vendor, you can do that under inquiry as well. And then this middle section that I kind of skipped over here, this is all, again, purchase order processing related information. So that's it for inquiry. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at some reports in the system. So one of the most important is it's month end. Let's see what our outstanding payables are. So under the reports, trial balance, so I have a couple different options in here. One very important note is my age trial balance. That is my trial balance as of this exact moment. My historical age trial balance, that's going to be my trial balance as of a certain date. So I can backdate my historical age trial balance. So say I can make it at the end of the month. So depending on what you're trying to look for, it is going to determine which report you're going to pull right here. So right now I'm just going to select my age trial balance with options. I have a demo report out here. I'm going to select modify. And I have a couple different options in here. Well, what do I really want to see? Do I want to exclude credit balance? No, not really, so I'll leave that out. If I want to filter it just on certain vendors, I can do that here as well. If I want it to be a detailed report or a summary report, I can toggle off this option here in the top right. And then where I want this report to send to, I select destination. Let's go ahead and print it to the screen. Select OK. We're good. Let's go ahead and select print. So here we are. This is my trial balance as of this exact second. If I scroll down to the very bottom here, I can see that my total outstanding payables are $1.29 million. Other reports here, underneath history is a good one. If I ever just want to look at say, show me a full transaction listing between date 1 and date 2, I can select on this transaction history, summary or detail, and pull up that type of report. Outside of the history reports, if I want to re-pull some of my posting journals, so I mentioned earlier, just about everything you do in the system can be pulled after the fact. I would go to the posting journal section here, and I can pull my posting journals. So say it's the time of audit and they want to see the backup, or they want to see the posting journals and journal entries, I can do that from the posting journals report section. So other reports, these are kind of the canned Dynamics GP reports. You also have under Microsoft Dynamics GP SmartList. And I'll select the purchasing module, and let's take a look at the payables transactions. So underneath the payables transactions, and just when I select this asterisk, this is kind of the starting grounds for your reports. Much larger conversation on what you can do here in SmartList, but it is a very good resource to use because you can really kind of build your own reports. So by default, I'm giving these columns. I see my current transaction amount here on the right side. I see my document dates, invoice dates. If I wanted to add additional columns here, I can select columns, select add, and then scroll through the list and find what else I'm looking for. Maybe the posted date or the GL posting date. I can pull those fields in here as well. But that's SmartList. So SmartList is also another great area to pull the reports that you're looking for. Here's a vendor SmartList. Yeah. So that's it for reporting. We'll take a look at the routines. So it's the end of the year, end of the calendar year, and I'm ready to print 1099s. I would print my 1099s from the routine section. Just a quick note, this is your tax ID. I can also print my 1096s, and I can print kind of test alignment reports to make sure that actually when I run the full 1099 reporting that they print properly. And then also in here I can run my year-end close process, which you want to get into the habit of running. And there's a lot of documentation out there on how to run the year-end process within Dynamics GP. You run the Payables module pretty much at the same time you run the close process for the rest of them. Alright, so let's take a look at the utilities. If there are ever seemingly issues in the system, so let's say that I'm looking at a aging report for a vendor and just my periods don't add up, always start with the reconcile. So before you hit up your partner, before you contact Microsoft, do a bunch of research, whatever it might be, start with utilities, start with reconcile, and then maybe just hit the summary option here and hit process. So what that actually does is it looks at all the detailed transactions for a vendor, and then it updates the summary values. So for the most part, they should stay in sync, but say you're having posting problems, connection problems, whatever it is, you can get out of sync. Therefore, come in here, run the reconcile process. If you ever need to mass update 1099 information for vendors, we won't go into this now, but that can be done here underneath the update 1099 information window. And then if you ever need to remove transaction history from the system, so let's say we have 20 years of activity in the system and it's slowing down the system, let's go ahead and remove a couple years worth. You do have the capability to do that by yourself in GP. So just keep that in mind. All right, everyone, that is it. That is Payables 101 within Dynamics GP. We made it. From here, I would highly recommend, spend some time looking a little bit deeper. We really just kind of touched the surface today on what you can do within the Payables module. We just very briefly talked about tax schedules, EFT batches, 1099 processing, credit card processing. Those are all additional things that you can do. So definitely check them out. We have some blog posts out there on them. We have YouTube videos out there on them. But the resources are out there. We are very interested in what else you all want to hear about. So please let us know in the comments below. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn or check out the blog. And also subscribe. We'd love to keep you up to date on what we're up to. And then also hopefully we can continue to push out good content and help you develop your expertise as well. So again, subscribe, check us out. And that's it for today. Everyone, I appreciate your time. Hope you learned a lot. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.